Thanks for that, Adrian. It's great to see such a good crowd here this morning. As Adrian said, we wanted to wait to have any questions that you might have had for our keynote, because obviously that address was a perfect segue into some of the topics that this panel is going to delve into in a little bit more detail. Obviously, the accessibility of electricity supply and the optimization of that supply is a key consideration for mining operations, and some of the topics that our keynote speaker got into that. As I said, this panel is designed to allow us, with a broader number of speakers, to delve into some of those issues a little bit further. So with that, we'll jump right in, and the format that we wanted to use is we had a few questions that I was going to pose to the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. So please feel free to any of the questions that you had for our keynote from his address. Please feel free to address them at that time, and also anything that comes out of our panel discussion. So maybe the first question, and we'll just go through the group here, and I'll maybe start with Stephen, is to talk about how it is that the current low commodity cycle has influenced your energy strategy. And as I say, maybe we can start with Stephen, and then we'll sort of go down.
Sure. Well, I think John talked a little bit about it, in that we have mines in West Africa and South America, and we're very much dependent on hydrocarbons to drive our energy needs. So those costs are quite high. The good news is, with oil falling from $100 a barrel to $45 a barrel, we've seen a significant drop in our energy costs. So that's the good side of it. We, unfortunately, as well, have always had a hard time with renewables when you look at the upfront cost of renewables versus our mine lives. So I think John mentioned 8 to 10 years. Most mines, their lives aren't extremely long versus the amount of time you need to recover your renewable investment, especially around solar or wind. That's changing, though, Valerie, and what the good news on that for renewables is that with the improvement in technology, we're just seeing a tremendous incentive to continue our research and, more importantly, our drive towards renewables. We have a 5-megawatt solar facility in Suriname, which has been a tremendous success. We are looking at moving ahead, even with the low fuel prices, hydrocarbon fuel-generated prices. We're looking at moving ahead in Burkina Faso with solar. So the good news around renewables is that with technology improvements, we're seeing the cost drop significantly, which is setting the stage for renewables to play a more and more important role in keeping costs down in the mining sector going forward.
And maybe we could go next to Paul, and then Daniel, and follow it up with John. So maybe Paul.
Sure. I mean, I guess we've got a bit of a different project with Western Copper and Gold. We're developing the Casino project, which is located in the Yukon. And so when we're talking renewables, solar is a bit of a question mark, considering that for half the year there's not a lot of light. But in terms of the question, has the current commodity price environment changed our thinking? I mean, our project, really the key generator of energy is liquefied natural gas, and bringing that liquefied natural gas up to site. Northern Canada is a challenge sort of similar, I think, to Africa, in that you have remote sites. You need to have a sort of transportable energy that you can bring to the site. And when we did our feasibility study on this project, and I'll sort of answer the question by saying how the high commodity price environment really dictated what we did of a few years ago, and we looked at diesel, it just really was a non-starter for a couple of reasons. One is the cost, but also just from a social license to operate in the north. Building a 150 megawatt diesel generation system just was not something that was going to fly. So we really zoned in on natural gas, and in that area, particularly northern British Columbia, is a very large producer of natural gas, and looking at the idea of liquefying that and trucking that to site became very, very key.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great comment about social license, and I think we want to delve into a little bit of that later, but it's great to have those two comments right back to back, because of course the location is a key factor. Maybe with that, Daniel, we could turn to you from your experience to have your comments.
Our project is mainly in Ghana, in the West Africa region. Ghana, a few years ago, prided itself in low-cost hydro, which obviously, as John indicated, we were exporting. But the rainfall pattern over the last few years and the damming of upstream has limited our ability to get a lot out of the hydro. So unfortunately, a lot of investment haven't gone into the national grid in catching up with the growth as well. So the mines are seriously looking at alternatives. The renewables are one of them. But I think what is playing up, if you talk about solar as well, I think the land space is also a factor in determining that. And we, in West Africa, have the West Africa gas pipeline, and then the Ghana gas, because we've just recently found oil. And so we're looking at our abilities to use the gas in terms of generating power through the IPPs. Unfortunately, the limiting factor is that you haven't got a gas everywhere, so you need to probably go into other senses. But definitely we're looking into combination of solar and the gas. The question you asked initially was to do with how that is impacting on the, obviously gas is a lot cheaper than a diesel, and it gives you much cleaner distance as well. And so our initial tendency is to doing that. The advantage that we find because of our complex transmission network as well is if you do have those renewables, they're right next door to you, which allows you to cut through the transmission issues that you normally have in those type of the world.
And maybe John, I mean, you touched on a little bit of this in your keynote, but having heard some of the comments from your panelists, I'm not sure if you have anything to add on that particular point of, how is it that the current low commodity cycle has influenced your strategy?
It probably really hasn't changed our strategy that much. I mean, we initially started our original study on the economics of the project was with diesel generators and had a fairly eye-watering electricity cost associated with that. And then we spent quite a bit of time in the feasibility study looking at the linking to the grid, which is, as I said, only 4 kilometres away. So that became first prize. I think if we're probably, I guess, fair to characterise us as control freaks. So the fact that if our primary source of electricity is outside of our control somewhat, that would probably lead to a few sleepless nights. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about what our backup situation will be, and that's really where we've looked at diesel, and then where we can go with solar. I attended a round table with Caterpillar last night, and I was slinking under the table as they were talking about approaching this as an integrated solution, because we're sort of getting a little bit arse about where we've set our strategy, and now we're sort of trying to work out how solar will fit into that, rather than maybe starting with a blank sheet of paper. But I'm promising to do better next time.
Well, it's interesting, in each of your comments, I think you each sort of touched upon this idea of having a combination of different energy supply sources, and maybe we could just sort of pick up on that, and maybe start with you, Paul, as to, what are some of the factors that go into, on the assumption that you might go with an alternative supply of deciding whether it's sort of a combination of a particular source of supply. And some of you sort of spoke about hydro and solar, some of you spoke about gas and renewables, and what are some of the considerations when you think about whether you're going to just use one source of supply or perhaps a combination?
I'm sure, and John really touched on this in his keynote. I mean, if we look at our casino project, I mean, it's big SAG mill, big ball mill. I went through the costs, and 40% of the costs are electricity. So you need to have absolutely reliable energy source, sort of 24/7, and this is a large, low-grade operation, so you have to keep it running the whole time. So I think that's sort of the primary thing that you're looking at when you're looking at your energy mix, is the reliability of that energy that's coming. So, when we looked at the mix of energy that we were looking at for our casino project, You know, we spent quite a bit of time looking at renewables in addition to the backbone, which is really this liquefied natural gas. And you know, for us, we did quite an exhaustive look at all the, you know, the wind, and like I said, solar we could write off pretty quickly, but also in you know, that part of Canada, there's run-of-river hydro and some of those things as well. You know, we actually couldn't find any of those that really worked, so really we're looking at, you know, liquefied natural gas as the primary, with actually some backup with diesel for us.
Yeah, I think, Paul, you touched on reliability, which is key for our operation. If you don't have reliable power and it's even cheap, and your backup to get you back in, say, solar, and I think a few years ago, the battery options and things weren't really well developed. They're now coming in, but at the time, you couldn't take that decision, because if you're out and you don't have the battery storage to allow you to run quickly, and your starting loads are also normally, starting currents are quite high, which limits you in some of those instances, then you're in trouble.
John, if you have any sort of additional comments. I mean, again, we're sort of delving a bit into some of the things that you touched upon already in your keynote, but that sort of idea of how do you decide on the type of source of supply and whether or not it's just a one type of technology or a combination?
Again, I guess it touches on what the other panelists have said about the reliability and the availability. Really, where we are for the size of operation, we're looking at there's diesel, high-speed diesel is really the answer. The fact that one of our other mining companies put a 90 kV line 4 kilometres away was very thoughtful. So we're planning to use that as well, which is pretty unusual, and that's really an anomaly where we are. And then it gets back to just how many eggs are we willing to put in that basket of grid power, and we're not willing to bet the farm on that, because the grid power for us at a higher, albeit at a higher diesel price, was close to 10% saving for us, and a relatively quick payback against an elevated diesel price. That's not quite so much today, but we can still probably break even against a $30 a barrel price of Brent. So it's still meaningful for us, and I don't know if there's too many people in the room that would be willing to bet oil stays where it is for the next 10 years. So I think that's the consideration for us. I think where we can, we're going to look to use solar cost effectively to mitigate that diesel use. Maybe at some point in the future, we can, with appropriate storage technologies, we could be on the grid with pure solar and backup storage, and that would be great, but that might be the next project.
I mean, Stephen, in your opening comments, you touched upon the price of oil, and you also touched upon the declining price in technologies and in renewables. And maybe you could expand on that a little bit to sort of talk about how you've seen, you know, the energy risks and costs change in your operations over the last sort of few years, and where you see that sort of going in the next few years.
Well, I'm, as Adrian said, I'm extremely excited about it. You know, 1 hour of sunlight is enough to supply the entire world's power needs for an entire year. I don't know if people knew that, but 1 hour equals 1 year for the entire world. Now, a lot of this is futuristic, obviously, and somewhat fictional in many people's minds, but I'm sitting back and seeing battery technology, energy storage technology change at an exponential rate. Right now, we have about 62 megawatts of energy storage capability in the United States. How much is that going to increase in the next 2 years? 14 times. We're going to move to a solid gigawatt and higher of energy storage capability. This changes the world. This changes our mine in Burkina Faso. We spend $85 million a year on diesel, heavy oil fuel. $85 million a year. You can do a lot with $85 million. And if we can get a solar farm built in Burkina Faso that can store the energy that's created by that solar farm so we can run continuously, it changes the mine life. and changes the whole community. We employ 2,000 people there. So there's just a tremendous amount we can do with lower energy costs. A, we help the environment. B, we help the economics of the mine. And C, and maybe most importantly, C, we help the community. Because if you go to Burkina Faso, as John knows, where the average income is $900 a year, anything you can do to have employment, improve the economic conditions, helps the country, helps the mining industry. So keep an eye on energy storage. In Ontario now, you can have your solar panels feed a battery in your home that'll run your refrigerator and your security lights all night long. And it's at a very low cost. This is coming very quickly. And as miners, as a 60-year-old miner, I need to make sure we stay ahead of the curve. Because I spent 30 years in the oil and gas business. And if anybody would have asked me a year ago if oil was going to be at $45, I would have said, you're crazy. I think oil is going to stay low. And I think it's going to stay low because I think energy supply and storage is going to offset demand. That's just my view.
Well, it's clear, obviously, from the panelists that the cost of energy is a fundamental, and Paul made the point, which is staggering, when you looked at your numbers, that 40% of your costs were associated with electricity. I'm interested to sort of hear your comments, though, as to those who are developing, when one's developing a mine, if the awareness and the importance of that electricity supply holds equal importance when you're developing, and if there's those considerations are taken into account when one is developing a mine, and if they're sort of equal with all the issues associated with just mine development on its own. Maybe we can start with John with that.
Sure. I think one of the differences between developing a mine and operating a mine is that when you're operating it, you're generally paying for someone else's mistakes. And when you're developing it, you're making them for someone else, hopefully, to worry through. Yeah. It's, probably a little bit too much candour there, but anyway. So we came to the project with effectively a blank sheet of paper. The grid capacity did obviously push us down that road. I think when we looked at, we developed the Sabodala project, we had very much, this is it's not that long ago, it's probably 7 or 8 years ago, but it's effectively a generation ago, or 2 generations ago in some of the technologies. And it would have had a big effect, I think, on the way we went. I think we sort of had a faction that went down a particular road that probably didn't make a lot of sense at the time, and now if we had our time over again, I think we'd do things differently. I think one of the things that solar especially has in its favour now is that it's scalable. I mean, you don't have to actually have a full meal deal from day one. You could actually put a solar facility in and power some, either keep it separate from your full operation or start to integrate it and then just add more and more solar cells as you wanted to, as the efficiency improved or whatever. So you don't actually have to, I think, make the big decisions all at once. You could do it incrementally now, and I think that's probably a big improvement in the technology from our perspective.
Daniel, if you want to...
You did ask the question if it impacts on your project. Yes, it does. I mean, as Paul indicated earlier on, it constitutes about 30% to 40% of your cost, processing costs, and those parameters go into your optimization, which determines your mine life. There's not many high-grade ore bodies sitting around these days. If you were dealing with half an ounce of those kind of things, some of those things are not consequential, but with current large volume, low-grade ore bodies, that cost, and with the gold price where it's sitting now, even if the gold price was there, it's a big determinant in terms of how, so bringing that cost down or having a mix that brings it down, it's very essential and adds to your mine economics and life.
Maybe, Paul, you can sort of jump in the way that John sort of put it was kind of exactly what I was getting at, but, it being front of mind and the development stage.
The history of the Casino deposit, we've had it and been developing it for 9 years, and it was first sort of discovered in the 90s, and it's a large, low-grade deposit, and it sort of sat there for a while because people said, well, there's no energy up there, you're never going to be able to develop it. It's, you know, it's a stranded resource, and if you look at Canada's north and the development of Canada's north, there's a lot of stranded resources. So, I mean, really, it was number one thing that we needed to solve on that project was how are we going to bring energy in? And it's sort of interesting how fast things change. When we did our first pre-feasibility study on the project in 2008, it was a coal-fired power plant. And that's, you know, that's public document, coal-fired power plant. The project looked okay. We were going to bring coal in. Well, you know, by the time the feasibility study was pre-feasibility study was out, a year later, it was like, we're never going to be able to build a coal-fired power plant in Canada. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So we had to move quite quickly from that to see what was the next, you know, what was going to be able to replace that coal-fired power plant in terms of an energy solution, and that's where we ended up with the liquefied natural gas and bringing that in. But yeah, I mean, it was actually the key part of us being able to develop that project.
And each of you in your comments have touched upon social license and community in different ways. Certainly here in Canada, from an energy generation perspective, we have you know, clearly seen an evolution of the involvement of Aboriginal people in energy projects to the point where in many projects it's not just sort of a benefits type of arrangement, but rather a sort of full partnership arrangement. I'm curious to see if that's something that you're seeing in some of the operations, you know, whether it's in northern Canada or in Africa or otherwise, in terms of actual involvement of local community members in energy projects and in the energy supply to the mines, and if you sort of see that as a way in the future that there might be sort of more social license buy-in, and maybe we can start, Daniel, with you. And
well, typically most mines are in very remote areas, and as you agree, in those remote areas there's no services to those areas at all. So it's the positives in having the mines there is the kind of services that the mines bring to bear on the communities, immediate communities, which includes roads and telecommunications and all sort of things in our part of the world. But importantly, if you have power as well, this renewable power in that area, certainly that impacts on those immediate communities where you bring the service in that area, as well as job generation, because you have a life of mine. I might just want to point out that John in his submission as well did mention the fact that some of the people's determined to invest that capital depends on life of mine. That is true, but I've seen mines that started off a 5-year mine life and 10 years later is still operating. So we tend to take short-term decisions as well and say, oh, we've only got 5 months, I can't do it, and you keep going and we just roll it over. So that's some of the thing that we find ourselves in as well.
And maybe, Stephen, you could comment just on whether you sort of see, you know, engagement by local communities in energy projects as a way to possibly obtain that social license and get some community buy-in.
Well, right now, you know, every morning at Essakane, our mine in Burkina Faso, we probably have 100 people at the gate trying to get in because they want to have work, probably higher than that. But do this math with me, just humor me for 30 seconds. Write down $1,100, and we're talking about the gold business now. Write down $1,100 on a piece of paper, and then write down $800 as an all-in sustaining cost to run the mine. And that's a pretty good number for most gold miners these days. That's $300 margin an ounce. And to build a new 100,000 ounce producer today, if you can build it between $200 and $300 million, you're very lucky. That means you have anywhere from a 7 to 10-year payback on your capital at today's costs. You tell me who's going to start a new mine at those economics in West Africa. John's already ahead, we're already there. New miners have got big challenges. And I'll tell you, the number one challenge right now in West Africa is employment. And these people want more mines, not fewer mines, because they don't have jobs. And if we're going to keep employment up, we need to find better ways to keep these mines running longer and get the capital back into the business to produce it. And unless we can get the cost down, which energy is a big part of, that's not going to happen.
Well, that's a great sort of segue into the next sort of thought that I wanted to get into, which is that, if you taking as a given, I think that all of you have said that you're interested in renewables as possibly being a energy supply source to mines. What sort of advice would you give somebody who's in the renewables sector who might be approaching you to say, we'd like to be an energy supply to your services, in terms of understanding the realities of your business and how it is that you might be able to do business together? Maybe John could start with you and go to Paul and Daniel.
Sure. I think all it takes is a very bullish outlook on metal prices and a very optimistic approach to exploration, and then I think we'll be able to meet in the middle ground. I think, as I touched on, the challenges are that we are dealing with long life infrastructure, and a lot of mines, especially mines that are put together by smaller companies, are just not. They don't have a long mine life in front of them. It doesn't mean that they won't have it. It's just that you can't put your hand on your heart and say this is going to be going for 20 years. As Daniel said, I mean, I worked at the Stawell Gold Mine, which had a 3-year mine life for 30 years. So it's just a matter of how much capital you put in, often to drilling out your resource and converting it to reserves. So I think an appreciation of that is very important. I think the vicissitudes of the commodity cycle and the price needs to be understood and appreciated as well, so that when we're looking at a return, I mean, that there's an appropriate return for the capital provided, but that it's on, trying to sort of have a little bit of a look into the future to see what the actual return period might be. And then I think also another interesting topic is sort of the whole of life sort of aspect of the project. Just because the mine life ends, it doesn't necessarily mean that the renewable energy generating source has to end either. It could be also repurposed to supply a grid if that's available, or local communities, or support some other industry, because, as Stephen said, employment and jobs are a big big factor in West Africa. Burkina Faso is a very poor country, effectively doesn't really have a manufacturing sector in many respects, and energy is still a big part of that, because most of the energy that Burkina Faso has is either imported or it's generated from diesel or HFO stations. So they're really starting a long way behind the 8 ball. So if there's a way that you can integrate some of that aspect into projects, I think all to the good.
Maybe Paul, you can add your comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, a couple. Our project is actually luckily a long life asset. It starts with a 22-year reserve. So, it is a project where we can spend more capital up front on the project if we're to look at a renewable resource. And, we've looked at a lot of different renewables. We've looked at solar, we've looked at wind, we've looked at run-of-river hydro. We'd love to incorporate them, but we just haven't been able to make them add up, I'll be honest. And so, in terms of people approaching us, I mean, it's, back to the comment here, it's a very, very tight margin business. And in today's commodity environment, it's even tighter. So, coming in, social license is certainly key, but, at the end of the day, the numbers really got to add up. I'd like to add, just following up on Stephen's point about, the long life of some of these renewables, though, I mean, one of the places that we are looking at using renewables is during the closure of the mine. I mean, in the closure of the mine, you reduce the number of people that are there, but there's still long-term monitoring of the mine site. And because of our remote location, what we're looking at is what can we do in terms of setting up, battery storage, a smaller grid at this point in time that's really just monitoring what's happening at site, but really what technologies can we bring into that operation at closure to really help remotely monitor that site. And so that's where I think that's an exciting area too, in terms of what you can do with these mine sites at closure as well.
Maybe with that, Adrian, I don't know, do we have some roving mics? Maybe we can open it to to the floor, which I can't see with these lights, but to see if there's any questions. Obviously been some interesting topics discussed in terms of course, pricing and social license and I can't see, Adrian, if you're going to somebody, if there's a question back there, or, okay.
Do I have to turn, it's on, okay. Here you are. Thank you. A lot has been said about the economic factors associated with making decisions about renewable energy. And I guess one of the factors in that economic decision which isn't a part of the equation is the cost of the emissions. And from that perspective, I wonder what the panel would think about costing the emissions and rolling that into the equation, and whether the industry should be a leader in getting the regulators to look into that as a way of balancing the economic equation.
Well, that's a great question, certainly leading up to climate change meeting in Paris. I don't know who maybe wants to go for it, Stephen.
I think that's an excellent point. How many people have spent a night in Beijing in December and woken up in the morning with a sore throat because of the pollution? Probably a lot of you. I have. I think a lot of it's going to be driven, Valerie and whoever asked the question. The mining industry is a pretty small variable on all this, but China, I think, India, the highly populated countries where this is really taking an effect, right or wrong, are going to drive this. And so, not to slough it off, but I think the mining industry, being as small it is right now, with the margins as tight as they are going to have to look to technology changes that are potentially driven from another area to help us. And I'm not trying to be selfish about it or abdicate, but reality is China's got such a massive issue with pollution and health that they are spending hundreds of billions of dollars as we speak on renewables, which ultimately I'm hopeful will help us with our emissions and our costs. I know that sounds selfish, but that's really what's happening.
No, for sure. There's obviously a question of scale. Does anybody want to add on to or respond to the question? Maybe Paul?
Well, I'll add a bit. I mean, as I said, we had a coal-fired power plant as an early sort of solution for the energy. And one of the things that moved us away from it was the fact that we started to put on, I can't remember what the number was, but the cost of the carbon emissions, because that was legislation that was being talked about being passed in Canada, and it was sort of like you need to factor that in. So, I mean, I think particularly in Canada, where with a new government, they're talking about some legislation around carbon emissions. I mean, it's something that you need to factor in. Mining projects, are certainly can be long life, such as ours, and also take a long time to get off the ground. So you need to sort of really be looking to that future and looking towards that taxed carbon future in terms of designing your project today and making sure you take that into consideration.
Thanks for that question. Was there any other questions? I see Adrian walking. Are you going to some? Oh yeah, perfect. Gosh. Yeah. Sure.
So a question: the financial metrics that I'm familiar with in evaluating mining projects, net present value, discounted cash flow, return on income, ROCE, are pretty well short-term metrics, but moving to renewables, mine projects that we're talking about have 20-year lifetimes, typically longer. Discounted cash flow doesn't make much difference after about 5 years. So are mining projects being evaluated on the proper metrics in order to actually have change? Or these are metrics that will just ensure we continue to do the same things?
Thanks for that question. That sort of picks up on some of the comments that I don't know if.
Are you talking as a shareholder?
I'm talking as a person who's involved in technology development in mining for a long time and seeing how short-term thinking actually inhibits progress.
Well, if you're a shareholder and you put in $1 million into the gold business, you're driven by returns, you're driven by getting your money back and a return on your investment. And in order for us to build the mines, we have to attract people who are thinking about getting their money back and getting a return. So we have to be driven by the metrics you mentioned. If we're able to combine those with technology that allows us to protect the environment and employ more people and add wealth to the planet in a safe way, that's exactly what we're trying to do. But you have that, call it challenge, of trying to return to the shareholder what they're expecting and also use technologies that provide environmentally friendly output. Good question.
Okay. My name is Arnold. I'm from R4 Mining and also responsible for the workshop pre-summit. And there were some questions yesterday in the summit, very interesting, and I would like to make this question for all of you. What about the future of electric vehicles in mining? Because we are talking about renewables, renewable energy, but it's renewable power. What about the renewable fuels? Okay, and thank you very much.
Thanks for that question. Thanks for bringing that forward from yesterday. I don't know if maybe Daniel or John, if you have any thoughts on that question.
I can throw
Paul's
something-
gonna.
I'll throw something
Paul's
in.
gonna jump.
It's actually something we looked at for the haul trucks. You know, for the casino mine, which is a large, you know, fairly standard open pit mine. One of the things we looked at was what's called the trolley assist haul trucks, which is, I don't know if you guys have been to Vancouver and seen the buses, but they got the things on the top, and so we looked very, very closely at using trolley assist for the mine haul fleet, and it looked very promising. It's not in the current project design, but it's one of those, you know, sort of, it's right on the sort of edge of really adding some significant value. And if you look at a lot of the large haul trucks that are used in open pit mining now, they actually have electric drives already in them, which is becoming more of a standard technology. So it's actually a fairly simple retrofit.
And they're looking at driverless trucks. And I know that's, I don't think, very far away. Again, the implication here, when 30% or 40% of your workforce is tied to driving, is what happens to employment in some of these countries where they're looking for employment when you bring in driverless trucks. So improves efficiency, improves productivity, and at the same time reduces employment. So you've got this challenge of how you manage that with the unions that are in place and the need to try and employ as many people as you can in these developing countries.
Daniel.
Yeah, Stephen, picking up your point, I think the challenge is huge. It's not just the unions, Stephen, it's the stakeholder community that you actually operate in. I mean, when you go there, most of the times the friction that you tend to get in this part of the world is the lack of employment. And there's so many of them that you can't employ everybody. So if you bring in community to bring those numbers down, you're going to have a lot of challenge unless that return gets invested into the community to create any alternative livelihood projects or investments in that community.
Yeah, it's a great question, how it sort of impacts on that social license, so thank you for that. I think there's another question over here.
My name's Graham Findlay with 3G Energy. We're a renewable energy company. The subject matter of the question is permitting issues. Over the last 10 years, I think we in the renewables industry have noticed the levels of frustration for development permitting. rising and rising as the standards become very high for wind and solar projects, and in some cases asymmetric standards. I've seen situations where a wind farm or a solar farm is one project requiring permitting, and the wire that takes the power to the user is another project requiring permitting under a different jurisdiction. So my question is to the panel, is the mining industry noticing asymmetric or having issues integrating renewables into their permits, and are they finding it frustrating because of potentially long permitting cycles for the renewable projects?
That's a great question, and also just that sort of integration of it all, and who takes that permitting risk, whether it's the renewable energy supplier or the mines. I don't know who'd like to take the first, maybe John.
Sure. I think for a lot of mining projects, a long permitting timeline is probably nothing too new. It's something. It is a challenge that the industry's had to deal with for a long time. For some unforeseen, hard to understand reasons, some people don't like mines near them. Can't fathom it myself, but anyway. And it does take a long time. And I think if you look in Burkina Faso, the permitting regime is, I think, quite well understood and well trodden. We're doing an underground mine, so it has a slightly different footprint, but we are looking at being in production 5 years, less than 5 years from the initial discovery drill hole. And that's pretty rare, and that's really speaks a lot to the jurisdiction of Burkina Faso and Stephen's earlier point that they really want mines there for generating jobs. It's plus 20% of GDP, and it's the most significant single source of government revenue. So there is actually a welcoming and pro-development attitude in many of the West African countries. One of the main obstacle I would imagine would be getting the land, and in Burkina Faso, as well as other jurisdictions, land tenure is somewhat more is different to what you experience in a lot of Western countries. It's not freehold title. There's a lot of traditional and customary use there, so you don't actually have a land owner with a title in hand. You may have a land chief who has been historically responsible for allocating land resources, and it's a critical resource in these countries where food security is obviously a major concern, and effectively subsistence agriculture is still the predominant employer of people. So you have a land take when you build a mine, and if you're building a solar farm, you'd have a land take as well. Now, having said that, there is quite a well-trodden path towards compensation, which is not egregious and seems quite reasonable and fair for all parties, as long as we obtain prior and informed consent and go through operated best practice. You can do that, I think, in Burkina Faso. You then have another layer of, I guess, complexity that you have to deal with the government bureaucracy and a sort of a government-owned power utility. So you don't have a sort of a history of competition and new providers coming into somewhere like Burkina Faso. So you have to operate within the framework that they have. There have been several IPP solar initiatives established in Burkina Faso of varying degrees, and I know it's been quite a long road for a lot of those guys for whatever reasons. But when you step back and you look at it in its simplest form, a solar farm in Burkina Faso generating electricity either for a captive mine or a captive mine plus the grid or into the grid is going to eventually happen. I mean, you can't stand in front of progress for that long. So I think where we see the permitting, as long as you follow the rules and you set out and you do what you've got to do and you engage with the local communities and effectively have a fair and reasonable transaction to take that land, you should be able to pursue your project.
Well, we very much appreciate the questions. I think we've got just maybe time for one more before the break.
Yeah, hello, this is Emily Thorne-Corte from Hatch. We're talking about reducing energy costs, and I was curious how all of your companies are looking at optimizing energy efficiency, both for new mines and for existing mines, and also both on the fuel side and the electricity side.
Well, one of the key things we've been looking at is lighting. LED lighting. And I'm not sure whether or not others are looking at it, but in our mines, it cuts our electricity use by about 60%. And in this building, hopefully they have LED lighting because the tremendous reduction in power use is well worth it. So that's just a simple example of where we can get energy efficient. We've recently hired what we call an energy auditor that are going to our sites to take a look at where we can save energy, reduce costs by becoming much more energy efficient, and because there's a lot to be saved there.
Yeah, I mean, we're also looking at the LEDs, but also one other aspect that we look into is the power factor correction units to also assist in, as well as, I mean, generally your startup procedures as well within the mine also helps in terms, because you don't, and the time of the period that you do that.
I think with that we will we'll wrap it up. Thank you for your questions, and please join me in thanking the panel for a great conversation this morning.